Hioms versus Hadrian's Wall, starring Jacob and Paul. Narrated by me, Daniel Edward Gutteridge. The Siegedunum Roman fort, which translates to strong fort in English, is the starting point for this 153-kilometre journey. The fort is located in present-day Newcastle upon Tyne and is the first fort travelling from east to west upon Hadrian's Wall. It wasn't originally planned to be part of the wall, but was added along with 4 miles of extra wall 5 years later to protect an important river crossing. The original fort was completely destroyed as the city of Newcastle grew around it. Today, the stones can be found in the foundations of local churches, pubs and other buildings. The early miles of the journey had little to do with Roman history. The path followed the River Tyne from the eastern outskirts of Newcastle into downtown, which was about an 8-kilometre jog with many twists and turns. The paths were an easy and relaxing introduction into what would be 5 hard days of running for Jacob and Paul. 7 bridges span the River Tyne, and the waterfront is bustling with culture and history. In Roman times, only 1 bridge provided the crossing between the north and south, and today a swing bridge is located on the site of the former Roman crossing. The second Roman fort was on the hill and guarded this important river crossing. The waterfront had many sculptures and monuments and ping pong. These guys are meant to be running and studying history, and they're playing ping pong. Are you serious? As we leave Newcastle, we see many modern travel conveniences. The bike, automobiles, bridges and overpasses, all of which allow us to move around much faster than in ancient times. However, this journey was to be all by foot. "22 kilometres from the Siegedunum, we see the first of what will be a familiar sight from here onward. The Hadrian's Wall path is marked by an upside-down acorn, which is the English National Trust trail sign. Remember the acorns. Losing sight of them has consequences, as the Hioms will find out later. The trail leads from the river up a tough 3-kilometre hill to the village of Hadrian on the Wall. This is where we see intact remains of the original Hadrian's Wall for the first time. In Roman times, the wall would have stood 16 feet high and was about 6 feet wide. Today, the ruins are only a few feet high, as much of the stone was removed piece by local residents for buildings and for roads. Leave the wall behind. The trail follows the road and passes through an increasing number of gates and fields. The truth, however, was that the road was actually following the wall remains, as Paul explains to us now.
So this is called the military road, and right here, all of this is wall stone underneath, and in the 1700s I think it was, they built the military road for getting horses and men from the east to the west coast. So that's what came the wall here.
Our final break for the day is at the site of Vindabala, which is our third and last Roman fort visited on the first day. Vindabala has not been excavated, but mounds are visible in the farmers' fields in the south of the military road. This plaque shows how large the fort was. In its heyday, Vindabala Fort housed 500 Roman soldiers who travelled here from Lower Germany. Back on the trail, Paul and Jacob stop for a much-needed refreshment break. When running long distances, or stumbling about for a while, much like Paul, it is important to stay hydrated and eat nutrient-dense snacks. Romans marching along the wall wouldn't have had this advantage, but would have had a view much like what we see here today. The last steps of a 36-kilometre day, and back to the farmhouse that was to be Paul and Jacob's base for the first 3 nights of their trip. Now, The question I'm sure you're asking is, how did they get here? Well, literally, they took Seabus, SkyTrain, Air Canada, the Tube, made a quick stop for Big Ben, and football. Then a train to Newcastle and a car ride. But if you really want to understand how to train for a multi-day trail run, you need to turn to the experts. Here are Phil and Grace Higham of Dirty Feet Racing.
Can you give me some examples of specific trips that you have done?
We ran rim to rim the Grand Canyon. It's a 42-kilometer trail. Took 10.5 hours. We started, it was only about 8 degrees at the top of the rim. And you get down to the bottom and it's 35 degrees. So preparing for multiple temperatures is a challenge for sure.
We also ran the West Highland Way in Scotland. So that was a 5-day running trip with 143 kilometers that we covered. Those are some of the running trips.
The one in Australia, which was a multi-day, was it 5 days, 140k in the southwest corner of Australia, which we took our backpacking gear with us. So it was a lot more gear to carry. But
and we ran the West Coast Trail in 2 days, which again, carrying all your backpacking gear and food for 2 days.
we hope to do that one in one,
Yeah, this year's plan is hopefully to do it in 1 day.
80k.
What suggestions do you have for running a long distance over multiple days?
Fuel properly, good footwear, the right socks.
Multiple different footwear, so that if you do start having a problem from one of your pairs of shoes, you have a different pair of shoes that isn't the same model, so that if the hotspot has developed because of the shoe, you can then change into a different shoe and hopefully stop that hotspot from happening.
Lots of Coca-Cola. It's essential.
And going slow, so that you can not burn yourself out in day 1 or day 2, so that you still have energy the next days.
You have to remember you need to recover from one day to the next, and it may not happen that quickly, so you need to prepare for a 5-day run and not to be like, spend all the energy in the first day.
What tips do you have for training for a multi-day run?
Long, slow runs.
And practicing multiple days of running.
Back-to-back days are essential. We train for 50Ks or 100K runs. You may run a few runs during the week, but then Saturday, Sunday, always back-to-back days, because you're not going to go and do 50K one day and then 50 the next day. But if you do like a 20-30, then you still get 50K down in that 24-hour period.
What sort of gear should I be practicing with and planning to bring on the trip?
Whatever gear you are planning to bring on the trip is what you should always have with you when you're practicing.
So your pack, whatever you have in your pack, your food, your water, your first aid gear, your clothing you can take with you, and also make sure you make your footwear and your shoe and your socks are dialed in, because multiple days, that'll put you out of anything. If your feet are done or spoiled, you'll be hurting.
At any of your even 5 or 10 kilometer runs that you go on, you should run with a pack with your rain gear in it and your first aid kit and water for more than just the run that you're going on. So we'll do 10 kilometer runs, but I'll be carrying 2.5 liters of water, so that I'm practicing carrying that weight all the time.
Thank you.
Is that a wrap?
Jacob and Paul took all the advice and trained throughout the summer. You can see them here doing stairs in Capilano Canyon. Returning to the journey, the Hioms have now left Newcastle far behind. Here we see day 1 and 2 routed using Strava, an online tool used with GPS watches to track running progress. Paul and Ron, who is providing support for the journey, are preparing the GPS watch to capture the second day's progress. Friendly cows, farmers' fields and wheat were a common sight through the early miles of day 2. Beautiful landscapes, which you can imagine looked much the same in 122 AD as they do today. The landscape was scattered with remains from both Roman times and the Middle Ages, sometimes both, like this medieval watchtower constructed from Roman wall stones. Many styles of stiles and gates were seen over the next 4 days. In fact, over 300 were crossed by the end of the path. I used to go to school with a guy called Rich Styles. Wonder what he's doing now. I'm not recording a documentary for Canada. The next Roman fort was also excavated. Onum Fort was roughly the size of Vinnabala from the first day, and is a few minutes' walk from the town of Halton. The name Onum translates to the rock. A slab was found on the site indicating the fort was constructed by the 6th Legion. As we leave the rock, the vallum becomes more visible. Vallum translates to ditch and is ever present along the wall until nature provides its own defences at the crags. We see these on the 3rd day. Wall remains become more common as you move away from the populated areas. Signs mark many of the interesting wall remains, turrets and mile castles along the route. Chester's Bridge ruins can be seen in the water below. It is one of the most famous wall bridges built by the Romans. The remains are very visible despite 2,000 years of wear. The first well-excavated fort was the lunch stop for day 2 at Chester's. This fort overlooked the bridge river crossing and was home to a Roman cavalry unit from Spain. Chester's is famous for having the best preserved bathhouse on the wall. The hypocausts or columns seen here are an early example of central heating and would have kept the bathhouse warm throughout the year. A furnace was kept lit by slaves and heat passed through the columns to warm the floor above. Other buildings seen here included officers' quarters and stables, as this fort was a prestigious posting in its day. The Hadrian's Wall path has 6 stamps for collectors. We see Jacob collecting his 3rd stamp as they exit Chester's and continue on their journey. Hang on, third stamp? Where's he got the other 2 from? Turrets and castles were built every mile along the wall. Here we see Paul and another hiker exploring the ruins of a well-preserved turret. Ooh, another hiker? Has Paul made a friend? A hiker friend? A Hadrian's Wall friend? Running alongside the wall for so many hours, you can't help but be impressed with how large an undertaking it was. The entire length of the wall was built in 7 years, less than many of our modern-day construction projects.
This is Limestone Corner, the northernmost part of the Roman Empire.
In 117 AD, the Roman Empire was enormous, but the land we see before us escaped their reach. The map shows the extent of the Roman Empire, which covered large parts of Europe, Africa and the Middle East. It's amazing to think that people from as far away as Syria and Spain would have had a hand in building the wall. Just outside Broccolita Fort, we find one of the more curious sights at Hadrian's Wall. An intact Mithras temple stands a few hundred metres beyond the fort's wall. Mithras was a very popular cult in Roman legions. Roman soldiers would gather into the temple, perform rituals such as a soventula, the sacrificing of a sheep, cow and hen together. Despite being outlawed by the empire, Mithrams have been found in all corners of the empire. By the end of the day, Paul was suffering. Now, I don't want to say I told you so, but remember at the start of this piece when I said Paul would be stumbling through? Case and point. No more questions, Your Honour. Nearing the end of day 2, the wall passes from the plains to the hills and a vallum is no longer necessary. The view from the crags is spectacular. This gateway was one of the few open passes from the wild north into the empire and was guarded by soldiers from house steeds the fort that was the end of the second day. The evening of day 2 was tough for Paul, who struggled with leg issues, and there was a real doubt over his ability to continue. And suddenly I feel like an idiot for mocking him, don't I? The next morning, the Hioms decided to start day 3 slowly, giving Paul a chance to heal and a chance for both to enjoy what was going to be a very scenic day. Ron checked in at a number of stops along the route to make sure Paul got through the day. Homestead's Fort was the starting point for day 3. Originally, only a mile castle stood on the site, but a few years later the fort was added, presumably to protect the gap in the windsill ridge overlooking Nag Burn. The fort layout is unusual because it runs parallel to the wall rather than having the wall run through it. It also had no nearby running water and likely depended on rainwater collection and wells for its water needs. The fort was occupied continuously through the 2nd, 3rd and 4th centuries and was abandoned by the Romans along with the rest of the wall around 409 AD. This building is a granary and stored food supplies for an estimated 800 men stationed at homesteads. The pillars you see here kept the grain off the ground and away from vermin and the damp of this cold, wet climate. I could do with some of those in my flat, keep the mice out. Homesteads is the site of the best preserved toilet on Hadrian's Wall, and no, it isn't open to today's travellers. The toilet was actually a communal latrine used by many men. Wooden benches were situated on either side over channels which were flushed by collected rainwater. There was no toilet paper, instead communal sponges were rinsed in the basins we see here after each use. Leading out of Homesteads, the path took steep turns following the terrain up and down the crags. Stone steps are cut into the hillside to form the wall path and are very likely made from fallen wall stone. At Crag Loo we see a beautiful lake in the distance, which was the lunch stop for day 3. Now, a bit of history on Hadrian's Wall. The original wall was 117 kilometres long and was built after a visit by Emperor Hadrian in AD 122. The wall construction is thought to have taken about 7 years and was built by the 2nd, 6th and 20th legions of the Roman army. The construction of the wall changed across its length. The eastern part of the wall was originally built much broader than the west. Also, in the east, rubble and clay formed the core of the wall. In the middle, it was predominantly limestone mortar, and in the western half, the original wall was all turf, later converted to stone 50 or more years later. The wall was built to consolidate the edge of the empire and to keep out the Colodians, now known as Scots, who had resisted Roman rule despite many attempts to conquer them. The original wall was more of a lookout post, with about 3,000 men stationed upon it. Following the death of Emperor Hadrian in AD 138, his successor, Antoninus Pius, chose to construct a new wall about 100 miles north called the Antonine Wall. After repeated failed attempts to conquer the tribes between the two walls, the Romans retreated, abandoning the new wall and refortifying Hadrian's Wall. By the end of the century, it is estimated there were between 10 and 15,000 soldiers from all over the empire, locations as far away as Belgium, Germany, Spain, Iraq and Syria. Here we see Jacob descending from the crags at Steel Rig. This was the first portion of the wall that Paul and Jacob encountered when they visited in 2013. The rugged beauty and impressive construction were what inspired them to return and run the entire length. When they were here before, the area was blanketed in mist and heavy rain. Pretty standard weather for this part of the world. One theory put forth by historian Anthony Everett, author of The Rise of Rome, was that the wall was plastered and painted white so that it reflected and was visible from a great distance. This was to reflect the power of Rome. If this is true, it must have been an amazing spectacle. The crags on day 3 were definitely the most amazing part of the trip for physical beauty. The views to the lakes below and the landscape extending for miles in front of you were quite incredible. Here on Walltown Crags we see some of the tallest remaining section of Hadrian's Wall. Remember that in the 2nd century this was about 16 feet high. At this point the Hioms are almost 2/3 of the way across England and have completed over 2 marathons. The 3rd day of the journey ended at Gilsland, a small town at the western edge of the Pennine Mountains. Here we see Poltrosburn Mile Castle. The ruins in this area were well preserved, and it was here that archaeologists found evidence that allowed them to determine that the walkways on top of the wall were 12 feet above the ground. We also see Ron Harding, the less visible but nonetheless important member of the team. Ron drove Paul and Jacob between sites and helped to make sure they had everything they needed to survive 5 long days. Thanks, Ron!
Start of day 4. It's nice and sunny. Here's the wall.
Running in bad weather presents a number of new challenges. Footwear becomes very important. As footing becomes more treacherous and wet, feet can blister more quickly. Also, you need to dress warmly and keep the damp and cold as far away from your core as possible. Just listen to the rain on this downhill run.
We're at 48 feet. It'll be great weather for the walk.
The fort of Burdeswold provided much needed respite from the rain, and a deeper understanding of why the wall was built. Is that a Scot in the courtyard? Here is a signal tower. Very few remain along the wall as they were mainly built out of wood. These towers would have been the first alert in the case of an attack and would have signalled to larger forts and towns behind the wall such as Vindolanda. An upside down acorn. Remember, this marks the wall path. Unfortunately, this lovely fort was visited twice.
So here's where we took a wrong turn. We went straight through that gate, missed this, went that way and did a 4.5 kilometer loop. Fun, fun, fun. So now we head down that hill. Town of Newtown is next.
Oh look, Paul, is that an acorn? The wall path takes many funny detours. Here we see a lovely garden and a narrow path between the house and garage. Day 4 ended at Crosby-on-Eden and the Park Broom Lodge, where the boys enjoyed a well-deserved warm shower and a hot meal.
Nettles. Not fun. We shouldn't have tried to walk through them. We're trying to cut out time. Anyway, that's it for now. We're walking down a country road if you want to see it.
The final day of the trip was completely flat and had no Roman wall. This was made up for by the presence of endless amounts of cows and a road which apparently floods at high tide. Across the water we can see Scotland in the distance. Here we see a last sprint through the trees. This is about 4 kilometres from the finish. A final stop to dip Jacob's foot into the Irish Sea.
So we're 28.5 kilometers here on day 5. We're maybe a kilometer from the end. Getting a little bit tired. We're struggling on, doing our best. With traffic right now.
Won't be the last, I won't be the first. Find a way to where the sky meets the earth. It's alright and all wrong.
153 kilometres, 99 hours from Newcastle to Browness on Solway, and 2 weary travellers looking forward to a hot meal in a pub, which was closed. Could you get any more English? Stone steps are cut into the hillside to form the wall path and are very likely made from... I can't! It's getting late, guys. I can't speak no more. I've turned Dutch. Many styles of stiles and gates would be the fates in various ways over the next 4 days. In fact, over 300 were crossed and bossed by the end of the trail. See it for yourself if and Paul he not fail. Boom, 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 boom. Brap. Oh, I tell you what you need to do. You need to get yourself some that bubble bath, bit of lavender to smell, light a few candles, and sit back and enjoy the bathhouse of Chester's. Oh, I tell you what, on a Sunday night, there is nothing better.